Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started and go ahead and take your seats. We're going to jump right back into the book of Matthew. We're going over the Sermon on the Mount. See a lot of visitors here. It's wonderful to see y'all. Thanks for coming. Go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. The study on the Sermon on the Mount has been it's been an incredibly enlightening study so far, in the fact that we can broach so many topics and so many different ideas and concepts and many primary ideas, such as the theme of the kingdom of heaven. This is what the kingdom of heaven looks like. This is what it ought to look like. Characteristics of the members of the kingdom of heaven. And just multiple different ideas about that. In chapter 5, most notably and famous is the Beatitudes, the different blessings that are associated with promises, concepts of salt and light in our behavior, then narrowing it down even more specifically into concepts of murder, anger, lust, adultery, divorce, promises and oaths, retaliations, loving your neighbor as yourself. There's all these different concepts and ideas, but the most enlightening part of it is how uniquely consistent the entire theme is between all of those things. And that stands out particularly highly in chapter 6. We talked about this a lot last time, where we have these, don't do this, do these. Don't do that, do this. And the running theme is, God wants your heart. And there's a unique section in the way things are phrased, particularly in chapter 1, where it opens up this idea of beware. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who's in heaven. This is a strong phrase. This is not the first strong phrase that's been used in our study so far. But the idea, the first word, beware, or be warned, practicing your righteous before other people in order to be seen by them, that last section, in order to be seen by them. The consequence of having your heart in the wrong place, even though your actions are righteous, if the goal is to be seen by others, then that will be your reward, thus negating the attempts for righteousness in the first place. With each of these, don't do this, but rather do that, sections of this chapter, it is said, a few things we see a theme running through is, first and foremost, you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven, or you have already received your reward. And then the contrast, for example, in verse 2, where it says, Thus when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So there's this alternative to the don't do this, but rather do that. When you give, do it in such a way that no one knows. The goal is that your giving to help other people is something that is a symbolic of the intimate relationship between you and our Creator. And that's the same strain that we've seen through all of these examples when it comes down to giving, when it comes to praying. As we'll continue on, today we'll talk about fasting, laying up your treasures. So last time we got through this section of prayer, and then we got to the Lord's Prayer. We got to the model prayer that is presented to us in verse 9. We touched on it, but we didn't really get into it very much. And so we're going to start there today. So I'm going to start reading in verse 5 of chapter 6, and we'll pick up from there. It reads, "When you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them. For your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Revisiting this idea of prayer. We won't spend too much time on this. But the guidance given before we're given this prayer is one of enforcing the relationship between you and the Father. That word Father is going to stand out to us here in just a moment. But the idea of going into your room, into a secret place. We talked about last time the idea of talking to your parents, talking to your spouse, talking to anyone in such a way where the words you were used were clearly meant to be heard by someone else, and then expecting them to appreciate the authenticity of that conversation. That's just not how it works. There's no authenticity to the relationship. That's not how you would speak to someone. And that's your reward. So for something as deep and as personal as prayer, clearly there's a problem, there's a temptation, not just with these people in general, with the idea of in the synagogue boldly standing up before all the people present and making this eloquent status symbol of how righteous you are because of the eloquent but empty phrases that you can use. We talked about last time, what this section is not saying is that it's improper to pray in front of other people or in such a way that others can be heard. And it's also not saying that long, maybe eloquent prayers are a bad thing. The idea is this: we're enforcing this relationship between us and the Father. And so, let's break down this prayer a little bit further. Verse 9. There's a few things to note about this prayer that I think are really interesting. The idea of the first sentence, "Our Father in heaven." Keep in mind the audience and the readers here are going to see this passage of this, our Father in heaven. When Jesus, this, rebellious offshoot teacher, tells his followers to pray like this: "Our Father who is in heaven." That would have stood out. It actually blends in really well with what we talked about in our class on Wednesday that Michael did about the way that they were addressed. And so in Acts 4, it was presented with when they go and pray after being put on trial, they say, "Our sovereign Lord." And that's how they address God in their prayer. The Jews would have used more terminology like that. Sovereign Lord, King of the universe. The idea of saying God or Yahweh, it's going to have this more elevated sense. And then for Jesus to say, "Our Father who's in heaven," this is how you should pray. That would be a more rare thing to see. Even going back to the Old Testament, referring to God as our Father is certainly there, but it is Much, much less common than what we would see in the New Testament. In fact, there's only a handful, really, of times in the Old Testament where during prayer, God is referred to as Father. So in the Psalms, Isaiah 63:16, I'll read this. For you are our Father, though Abraham does not know us, and Israel does not acknowledge us. You, O Lord, are our Father, our Redeemer, from old is your name. That specific prayer in Isaiah is a prayer for mercy, of appealing to the Father, when in that same chapter he's referred to as Lord. And so this should be standing out to the hearers of this message. We built that prayer last time. And on Wednesday, we built out a prayer. If you're visiting with us on Wednesdays, we're doing a deep dive into biblical prayers. And on Wednesday, the passage was in Acts 4, where it addresses as the sovereign Lord, and we build out customized prayers at the end of the class after we go through that one. And what's funny is the term sovereign Lord stood out to me like I've never said that in my prayers. That's not how I speak with my Creator. I think in the same way, this opening sentence, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, would have stood out to the readers and the hearers of this message. That's not how we talk to Yahweh. So, with that being the case, and this being a different way than they would be accustomed to approaching our Creator in prayer, what should we think about then Jesus? This is I'm going to have a bunch of open-ended questions today, so sorry for that in advance. What should we then think about knowing what the end of the story? Knowing how this all is going to end, what should we think about when Jesus opens his prayer with the term, our Father in heaven?
I think of more of an intimate relationship rather than somebody you don't know, like a king or somebody in their time where you wouldn't have a relationship with. They would just be a king and a subject, where they rule over you and you just do what they say. In this case, it's an intimate relationship. You're actually communicating with that God, being God that you're actually talking to.
Yeah, that's one of my first notes here. It may not be an introduction to, but it is certainly a strong step advancing this idea of a familial relationship with our Creator. In the same way that we can draw ties to the way like the church is the bride of Christ. And that we are adopted, that that God the Father cares for us, the Son. Verse 4, your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Verse 8, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. We think about the other examples of like what father would give their son a snake when they ask for a fish. It's like there's this relationship of like, look, if my daughter comes to me and asks for something, I'm going to give her something. Like she comes to me and asks me for probably candy or probably a treat because she never gets those things. It's like, well, we can probably come to something that's mutually beneficial for you because I know what's best for you. And I know how you can be when you indulge these things. So maybe it's not best that you get exactly what you ask for, but I love the fact that you came and asked me instead of just going and taking it for yourself. There are things that are out of her reach inside of our house, though that's changing rapidly. It introduces this idea of this, I put like this bold confidence into being able to address our Creator as Father. It's going to really shift the idea, because we're looking for the deliverer, And one of the themes we've talked about so far is that's kind of what's been established here, these amazing comparisons to Jesus and Moses, the Israelites looking for the deliverer, for someone to bring us out of slavery, for someone to redeem us, to bring us out. But it's just not exactly what they're looking for here. And when you approach our God, it says, our Father who's in heaven. That doesn't ring the bell of this powerful, mighty, overthrowing countries and nations. It's the relationship. It's this familial thing. It's a protector. It's a guide. It's a provider. It's a confidant, someone who loves you and is taking care of you. What else? What else should we think about with the way this prayer is opened up? Yeah.
Jesus uses our Father in heaven, I think at least 20 times in Matthew as just the title of God. But it seems that it's opening this prayer to say that, God is the creator of the whole earth and everyone who lives on this earth. But saying our Father in heaven is a choice that we choose in faith to claim Him as our Father and to accept those rights and privileges of this kingdom of heaven that Jesus is talking about. And like Alan said, that brings into this personal relationship, but it's a choice to claim Him as our Father.
Absolutely. That's what I was going for. Thank you for reading my mind. I'm going to do some rapid fire on these passages. But this major new theme, the idea of addressing, how many times you said it was 22 times? Something, 20s? That doesn't happen until this point of this God being proclaimed as the Father, especially in prayer. And so Galatians 4 through 7, again, I'll just rapid fire read these for us so we can look at this from our perspective of knowing how the story ends. What's being kind of really advanced in this prayer is Galatians 4, verse 4. But when the fullness of time has come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. Romans 8, verse 14. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but have received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, provided we suffer with Him in order that we may also be glorified with Him. And then John 20. After Jesus' resurrection, prior to His ascension, in His address to Mary, He says in verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary. And when she turned and looked at Him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher, Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Opening up this prayer is really advancing this almost newish idea of how we address God our Father, how we view God our Father. And though it's certainly present in the Old Testament, it's not nearly as prevalent as it is now and is going to be going forward. So, reading through this prayer one more time, we're going to pick it apart a little bit more. Our Father who's in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. What are standouts about this prayer that we ought to consider for our regular prayer life? Like when you first read this prayer and Jesus says, when you pray, I want you to pray like this, and then delivers this prayer. What are some things we ought to be noticing about this prayer that we should be applying in our lives?
I like what it says in verse 10, the kingdom come, your will be done. God is always going to have a plan on earth and in heaven, so we can have faith in that plan.
Yeah.
Whether it's going the way we think it should or the way we don't think it needs to go.
That's a good one. That's part of the prayer that we talked about on Wednesday, if y'all were here before. It's the idea of like, to be able to say, your kingdom come and your will be done is a very humbling thing to say. The way it's not asking, hey, your kingdom come and get me better or do this for me. It's, I want your will to be done in my life here, just like it is in heaven. Whatever that ends up meaning for me, that's what I want to take place. You can't say that casually. Like, there's a lot of meat on the bone when it comes to saying something like that. It's just like, Lord, take me out of the equation. Josh?
I want to see that this prayer is that there's a structure and order to it. You put God first, and then your prayer, and then what you want follows after that. So your prayer helps you get your priorities right and centered as well.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
And even in verse 1, it talks about, you have an intimate relationship with our Father in heaven, but hallowed be your name. You recognize his power and his greatness, not just a simple Father.
Yeah.
It is somebody who has control of the universe.
Yeah.
And how great just his name is.
Absolutely. I'm glad you make that point. It's certainly worth saying. It's the idea of addressing God as a father is by no means lowering the tier. It's the idea of God coming, wanting to come dwell with us. It's the idea of God bringing this option to us, to those who would follow him. What else?
My favorite is the reference of daily bread. So it's not getting too caught up in the future, taking things one day at a time, focusing on what we have. It's real simple to get looking too far down the road and not thinking about it.
Yeah, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit when we get to verse 19. That's exactly right. The idea of just give us what we need. Give us the things that we need to get by. It's, again, that's also a humbling part of this prayer. Yes, ma'am.
Our relationship with God should be far above any other relationship we have on earth. Because here in chapter 10 of Matthew, Jesus says, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy, or mother more than me is not worthy of me. So if we have any problems with relationships here on earth, equal disappointments, it's nothing compared to our relationship with God.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you see that theme in the petitions that are put out in this, where, like Alan said, the idea of hallowed be your name, wanting God's will to be done, give us the things that we need, then this appeal for forgiveness and protection. It's like none of those things are, in absence of that relationship, how could you ask that of your Father? It's very hard to do, sincerely. And that's why the running theme throughout all this is the purity of heart in all these things that you're going to do. Whether it's giving, whether it's helping other people, being charitable, the way that you pray, it's doing it with that sincerity of heart, knowing who you're speaking to. Anything else? Yes, ma'am?
I love how he does his father. It shows the familial relationship, like you were saying, but yet he also says, hallowed be your name. So that implies a lot of respect. And when I've heard other people these days and times saying, well, it's like saying, hey, Pops, or hey, Daddy, that's not where we put God.
Right.
He's still very much in a place of respect in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw one more hand over here, I thought. Yeah.
We see this prayer, and you're asking yourself as it's leading up to this, he's saying, don't pray like these other people. And we have other examples of prayers that he's probably referencing. We know about the Pharisee and the tax collector when they go to pray to God and how their prayers are structured. Jesus is showing us that we have a shift in mindset from the things of the physical and from me to God and the spiritual. And his pattern here is really interesting, how he's giving glory to God, he's acknowledging God as the Father, but then he's asking for the things that are most important. He's asking for forgiveness. Without forgiveness, there's no redemption. And then after that, he's asking for us not to be led into temptation. Help us not to be separated from you again, our Father, and protect us. And going to Jerry's point, the only thing physically he's asking for is just the minimum. Just give me what I need. No more, no less. Have contentment. Just give me what I need physically to make it through. But my mind's on the spiritual, the eternal.
Right. And that goes back to verse 8. When it says, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. And the things that are specifically listed in this prayer are almost no-brainers, right? For somebody who would be a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. Assuming that everybody just checks all the boxes of everything we've discussed so far, though we've already established that that's not possible for us to do on our own. All of these kind of go without saying. Our desire is for God's will to be done, for food, provision, forgiveness, deliverance from temptations. Like these are all things that are known at this point, right? It's not a secret that we all need food and provision. It's not a secret to anyone that the idea of a citizen of God's kingdom would require forgiveness. The whole last back half of chapter 5 is this idea of deliverance from temptations and the things that pull us and draw us and how we ought to conduct ourselves and to grapple with that while we're here. But the point is that you approach your Father with these things. Or how much, if we were to just, outline style categorize all of the things in our life that fall under the idea of, I want God's will to be done on earth in my life. And I were to start itemizing that to say, what does that mean for me? And I were to write that down. That might mean a few things. That might mean you can't keep going at your job the way that you are. You have to change where you live. You have to change the things that you think are funny. You have to change things. You have to adjust your life. I want God's will to be done on earth through me like it is in heaven. The idea of food and provisions. It's like it's a known. We know we need that. But if I were to write that out, what do I need every single day? That list might actually be a lot shorter than it is right now, and than it may be in your life today. The things that we may think that you need, you might not. Itemizing forgiveness. Under a category, can you imagine the list? These are the things that I need forgiveness for. And then deliverance from temptations. is the same. These are the things that I struggle with. These are the things that pull me away. These are the things that I want. Lord, I'm bringing this prayer to you sincerely. So I'm going to tell you, these are the things that are drawing me away. So we read this prayer and we read it on a categorical basis, but if you itemize those things, then sincerely put that out there, the idea is that is what a genuine conversation with someone who is your all-loving Father looks like. I am struggling with how to conduct myself. I need help. I need deliverance. I have temptations that are pulling me away from what I really want. And that's for your will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so there's another running theme of these things is this idea of take precautionary measures. You might be more susceptible to the idea of caring what people think about how you pray more than you think. Therefore, go do it in secret. Make sure that intimate relationship is established, and that's how you communicate with your Father. Do what needs to be done to protect your heart, to protect the salt from being contaminated. And if our prayer life is contaminated, that's a really good indicator of how the relationship is. So when I read through this prayer, I think we should take precautionary measures, not to just read it on a purely categorical basis of this is what's being said, this is how I ought to pray. These are categories of things that I need to have very deep and sincere conversations with my Father and Creator about. Anything else before we move on?
When you recognize that God knows what we need, I mean, He is the creator of us, so He knew what we needed when He created us, because He created those needs within us. And the fact that you look at the kingdom and everything that is involved with that, it's just endless, the amount of things that if you went specifically in those terms, it would be endless, so your prayer would be forever. And then also the focus is on your helplessness. Without Him, because we try to fix things ourselves. And when we do that, we fall into temptation because we feel like we can overcome that ourselves. We can and do whatever we want, but this is a total humbling putting yourself under God and His control.
Yeah, you
in
can't.
Every aspect of this prayer.
I couldn't agree more. You cannot say this prayer and mean it sincerely without completely humbling yourself. Somebody, is there a hand in the back? John?
Yes, it reminds me of when we were studying Jacob's prayer a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, whatever that was. And that structure where it was the ABBA, the acknowledging the covenant, and then the expression of dependence, and then the petition, and then the acknowledgement of the covenant. This one is all of those things, and that you're acknowledging who God is, acknowledging the covenant that He has created, and your dependence. But it also, and the petition. But each one of those things are part of the new covenant that He has promised us. So it's not like, please give me these things that I need because this is an outlier. You've already promised to do these things for me. And I'm just bringing that up. So it's not like, please help me in this thing that's outside of your purview. You've already made this promise, and I am calling upon that promise.
Yeah.
And it's all of those things at the same time. And it's all covenantal, which is pretty awesome.
Which goes back to the idea of, can you imagine doing that sincerely if there's no relationship? Or with anyone that you know. I might know that someone happens to be proficient at something in my life. Wouldn't it be strange if I've just neglected that relationship completely? Then one day, randomly out of the blue, hey, let me lean on you for this. It would almost be inappropriate. I was like, wait. So you're only going to talk to me when you need something? That sincerity, that maintaining the relationship has to be there. Then verse 14, it's almost like, well, while we're talking about forgiveness, we're going to inject this in there too. In verse 14, after the prayer is concluded, he puts this little disclaimer. It says, "For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." Another bold claim. You've received your reward. There will be no reward for you in heaven. If you don't forgive other people, there's no forgiveness for you. I'm glad that these two verses come at the end of this prayer, because it suits the context much better. Because the idea in verse 12, forgive us of our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors, this comes on the path like you can't pray that prayer if you're not willing to forgive other people. It's the same concept of chapter 5, 23, 24. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Before you ask forgiveness of the Father, you have to be able to forgive. The citizens of the kingdom of heaven have a requirement upon us to be able to forgive others. And before you go ask the Lord to forgive you, you ought to go do that as well. Anything else on 14 before we move to 14, 15? The extension of the forgiveness concept.
I was just going to make a comment that it's really interesting when you look at 14, but when you actually go up and look at 12, I think a lot of times we read that, or maybe we just read and forget what has actually been said here. And it's laying the standard and foundation for forgiveness. He doesn't say forgive us our debts and stop. He doesn't say forgive us our debts and help us to forgive our debtors. He's saying forgive us as we have forgiven others. Again, don't forgive me more. Don't do more for me than what I've done for my fellow man. The bar stops at me. I can only go as far as what I have done.
Yeah.
I can't ask for any more, and I'm not going to give any more.
Yeah. And there's this the phraseology is it's a conclusion that's like, as I forgive. It's not that this would be inappropriate to pray for, but the idea that's given in the prayer is I am a forgiving person. Lord, please forgive me. I like the way that you presented that. It's like if I want the forgiveness of the Father, I had better be able to forgive. It's like bringing that bar up to where it needs to be, which was, not to be redundant, but that's been the chief issue between all of these things that we've talked about in the Sermon on the Mount so far, is this softening, this lowering of the bar, this following this oral tradition rather than the intention of the law in the first place. And so I like where this takes that bar and puts it right back up for us. Verse 16, another, do this, don't do that. And when you fast, don't do that, do this. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Same thing. Same thing we've seen so far. If you are doing something for the Father, do it in such a way that it's only for the Father. The ESV says, do not look gloomy. The Net version says, do not look sullen. This idea of wearing your temptations on your shoulder. There's this idea of there's like this reward through the victimized mentality. It's like, well, I'm this, have these struggles with this, whether it's deliberately, voluntarily, or not. Therefore, that entitles me to be perceived in a special kind of way or to a special type of treatment. Oh, you're a Pharisee. Clearly, you've taken on the law on your shoulders and therefore are entitled to this, that, or the other. You're fasting. Look at you. Look at you go. This is a really tongue-in-cheek way of phrasing this, but the way that I view this, I've played soccer my entire life. One of the things that I've always hated about a stereotype of soccer is flopping on the field. You know, when someone gets their toe stepped on and they go down grabbing their face, you know, it drives me absolutely crazy. That's kind of how I see this passage, where if we're fasting and we're struggling for something and we're wearing that on our sleeves so that everyone, this is my audience now to see how much I'm doing for my Creator, that's probably a kind of way of how God would view that. What are you doing? You're making a show out of this thing. This is supposed to be for us. This is supposed to be a you and me thing, and you're making this a spectacle for everyone else to see. You already got your reward. It's supposed to be this idea of refining this relationship between you and our Father. And the third promise that we've seen that goes along with this, your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Anything else on 16 through 18? Man.
So to go back to that last week, giving and sounding the trumpet.
Yeah.
When you're giving, it really is just, you know, are you doing this to serve God or are you doing it to serve yourself? And that's still a question.
Yeah. It's the same concept of it's like I'd rather you just not give. Don't fast if that's how you're going to do it. And that's what the Lord's saying here. Verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. And if your eye is bad, the whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. There's another. Don't do that. Do this. What is this section of Scripture not saying? Bell's going to ring in like 30 seconds. Yeah.
Don't not go to work today because you think God's going to take care of you.
Yeah. It's not saying don't take care of yourself. It's not saying don't be prudent. It's not saying don't make it to where you can also help take care of others. It's not saying we should all live destitute. It's not saying don't embrace the responsibilities that are put upon you. I think what this passage is saying is extremely similar to what everything else has been saying, but in the context of monies. It's a precautionary lesson on the idea of guarding your heart. Taking the preventative measures. Do not focus your life on laying up for yourselves treasures on earth. That's all temporary. That's all going away. But rather, chapter 5:29, pluck out your eye if it causes you to sin. 6 verse 4, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. 6 verse 6, shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret. 5 verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. It's a precautionary tale of protecting your heart against the temptations of wealth, the temptations of riches, of piling up more and more in your name, because it's all going away. When rather, we've already been told to pray for the things that we need, to be content with our portion, and to bring that sincere appeal to God on a regular basis. I think verse 22 is, I'm really glad verse 24 is in there, because 22 and 23 throw me off, and we'll pick that up next time. But thank you all for your comments. Thank you for coming. We're going to try to get through the rest of chapter 6 next time. We've still got a little bit of extra wiggle room in the calendar to finish out the quarter, so please finish out chapter 7, write down some questions, and bring them with you. Thank you.